Good morning, everyone. I'm not sure I'm going to sort anything out, but I'm certainly going to tell you what the problem is. And the topic in this case was given to me by Kevin. He's very good at assigning topics. It takes the burden off me to figure out what the heck I'm going to talk about. And the topic is Care of the Environment, the New Greatest Commandment. Now, that title is barely ironic. In fact, it's probably literally true. For we're in the midst of an astounding pontificate, which even Philip Lawler, a very resolutely mainstream commentator, has described as follows, and I quote, "A danger to the faith," end quote. When Mr. Lawler and people like him are beginning to see this problem, you know that we have an unparalleled situation before us, even in the midst of all of the turbulence of the past 50 years of the post-Vatican II epic. Now, what we're talking about here with this idea of ecological conversion that Kevin Diaz just mentioned is a pseudo-religion. It's another of these novel and all but meaningless terms that has plagued the Church since the Second Vatican Council. But we have to remember that it did not originate with Francis. The very phrase ecological conversion was first coined by John Paul II in an address on January 17, 2001. Quote, "We must therefore encourage and support the ecological conversion, which in recent decades has made humanity more sensitive to the catastrophe to which it has been heading. Man is no longer the Creator's steward, but an autonomous despot who is finally beginning to understand that he must stop at the edge of the abyss," end quote. The catastrophe, the abyss, not the end of the world in the time of Antichrist, but the end of the world if the imaginary average global temperature should ever reach 2 degrees centigrade higher than it is today. Now, John Paul II's warning of the imminent environmental apocalypse was more than 18 years ago. But in 2019, there is still no apocalypse. The politically incorrect guide to climate change makes a few observations in that regard. We've been warned repeatedly about tipping points, past which there will be no return and the world will be doomed. In 1982, the UN warned we have only 20 years. In 2007, after that tipping point had passed, the UN warned again that the new tipping point was 2012. In 2006, Al Gore declared that the tipping point was now 2016. But then in 2008, he warned that the tipping point had been adjusted to 2018. In 2009, Prince Charles warned that the latest tipping point was 2017, 2 years ago. In 2015, Irish Prime Minister Mary Robinson declared that the tipping point was less than 10 years, or 2025. So follow the bouncing tipping point. It goes on and on this way. Today, in 2019, we are being scolded ever more fiercely by the fanatics of the climate change ideology, led, most unfortunately, by the current occupant of the chair of Peter. The environmental apocalypse lies just ahead, always just ahead, by a convenient 10 years or 12 years in the future, so that the mass of the people, meaning you and me, can be prodded to do whatever government asks of us in fear of the climate change threat, like the mule who moves ahead in the hope of catching the proverbial carrot on the stick. But more than the assent to the dictates of government is being asked of us here. The climate change ideology calls for a religious assent of mind and will to its claim that the environmental apocalypse, which is always receding to the horizon, is not a mirage but is real. We must all profess with our mouths and believe in our hearts the apocalyptic threat of climate change is just around the corner. Just like we were expected to believe and profess in every climate scare of the past 200 years, all of which are documented in the guide I referred to. The great climatic change of 1914 that was surely going to lead to a worldwide drought, as the press was saying then. Or the imminent melting of the polar ice cap back in 1958. The Earth was getting warmer back then, so the press was warning. But wait, there was the global cooling scare of the 1970s. Remember that one? A new ice age was just around the corner. The Earth was getting cooler, not warmer. Then came the 1980s, during which, as the politically incorrect guide notes, there was a hiatus between climate change panics. But then, says the guide, came the big switch. From the global cooling scare of the 1970s back to the original global warming scare of the 1950s. So in 1988, the United Nations established the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. And CO2, carbon dioxide, and other greenhouse gases, including methane, which is largely the result of cow flatulence on farms and agricultural production with fertilizers, these became the new threat to the survival of our planet. And since then, we've seen a vast international network of climate change bureaucracies and regulations that have emerged to impose the new narrative of the imminent planetary death on account of greenhouse gases. So now we must profess and believe that the world will end unless we do something about CO2, methane, and other greenhouse gases. CO2 being the very thing we exhale all day long, every day of our lives. So perhaps we should take shallow breaths to make our first contribution to avoiding the environmental sin. Don't breathe as often. But the world will end if the global temperature rises by more than 2 degrees centigrade because of the rise of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is now depicted as a poisonous gas. It's actually a very basic part of the natural world. Now, consider even the extent to which they've gone in promoting this myth as an obligation of belief. They want to criminalize climate change denial. I'm an attorney, so I follow some of the literature in law reviews and other legal publications. There's actually a serious body of scholarship now exploring the ways in which denial of climate change can be criminalized. Let me give you an example. 2012 article in a journal called Ecological Law Quarterly. Quote, "No longer can there be any doubt that anthropogenic, human-caused warming of the planet is happening. Climate change poses a grave threat to humankind," end quote. But then the author frets about how the people just don't seem to be buying it. In fact, he writes, there has been, and I'm quoting him, a shift in public opinion and a failure of political will since the turn of the millennium, he says, because, quote, a sophisticated nationwide public relations campaign designed to conceal the dangers of burning fossil fuels from the American public by deceiving it as to the true state of climate science. That campaign has been successful. People don't buy it. And this dastardly deception, says the author of this serious piece of legal journalism, is, and I quote, arguably punishable as a criminal offense. And he goes on to expound various legal theories about how it could be criminalized. And there are numerous articles and editorials along the same line. Just Google it, and you'll see it. I'm talking about law reviews here. Law reviews and other scholarly publications, not just some wild-eyed leftist commentator on MSNBC. Well, let me declare myself here and now. I am a climate change denier. The so-called science of climate change, like the so-called science of the evolution of men from molecules, is an elaborate hoax. It cloaks an ideology designed to facilitate a limitless expansion of government power. That's what the 1.5 centigrade degrees goal of the Paris Accords is all about. You see, you have to have a benchmark, because then you can tell people that this is the benchmark we have to meet, and to meet that benchmark we have to impose various legislative remedies, including the carbon tax, cap and trade, various other environmental regulations, a ban on fossil fuels, etc. And who will suffer from all of this? Not the masters of the universe, not the heads of the multinationals, but you and me and the world's poor, who depend upon fossil fuels to heat their homes, to provide electricity wherever they have it. Now, where did this 2 degrees centigrade threshold come from, such that under the Paris Accords we can't go higher than 1.5 degrees centigrade? Where did it come from? I quote to you an excellent resource, and I suggest you go there frequently for updates. It's set up like the Drudge Report, but it has a lot of scholarly articles in which the climate change community reveals things about itself that you need to know. And that's called Climate Change Depot. And here's a quote from that resource. In fact, the 2 degree centigrade threshold was unscientifically plucked out of thin air, as the University of East Anglia's Phil Jones inadvertently admitted in ClimateGate 2.0. Now, ClimateGate 2.0 was a cache of hacked emails between climate scientists, which, like ClimateGate 1.0, revealed what they were thinking about their own theory, how they were criticizing their own theories, how they were admitting that the data was fudged, how they were telling each other this is really a political movement, not a scientific movement. It was devastating. Both of these ClimateGate scandals were devastating. And according to this source, to continue the quote, The UK Met Office subsequently admitted this, as well as the Washington Post, that the 2 degrees centigrade threat was plucked out of thin air. Now, this is not the place at the time, I don't have the time, to lay out a complete case for the utter falsity of climate change claims. A few examples will have to suffice. First, let's talk about the alleged measurement of rising temperatures by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. Business Investors Daily, which is hardly a fringe publication, notes that the NOAA, or NOAA data, seems to be, and I'm quoting, a captive of the global warming religion. Its data are fraudulent. That's right, outright fraudulent. Here's how the article shows this. NOAA has made repeated adjustments to the data for the presumed scientific reason of making the data more accurate. But all their changes point to one thing: lowering previously measured temperatures to show cooler weather in the past, and raising more recent temperatures to show warming in the recent present. This creates the illusion of an ever-rising temperature to match the increase in CO2 of the Earth's atmosphere since the mid-1800s, which global warming advocates say is a cause and effect relationship. The more CO2, the more warming. The article goes on to say that NOAA's statisticians adjust the data using complex statistical models. In other words, the data adjustments are driven by models, and the computer models are driven in turn by the assumptions under which the models were created. And so the resulting data changes, says the article, do not reflect reality, but rather the underlying theory of global warming. It's a self-validating computer model. Now, what this article also points out is there may have been errors in the data over the decades, but statistically speaking, data errors average out. Some are for and some are against a particular conclusion. But that's not what NOAA is doing. They're not averaging out the errors. They're correcting all of the errors in one direction with their computer models in favor of the climate change theory. So, to quote the article, far from legitimately adjusting anything, it appears they are cooking the data to show a politically correct trend toward global warming. And Tony Heller at the Real Client Science Web points out, pre-2000 temperatures are progressively cooled, post-2000 temperatures are warmed. This year has been a particularly spectacular episode of data tampering by NOAA as they introduced nearly 2.5 degrees centigrade of fake warming since 1895 by taking the data and manipulating it. The data didn't show it, they adjusted it to make it show that. So the global warming scare, the article concludes, and I quote, is basically a hoax. Here's a second example. I find this amusing. Popular Science. Quote, if the world gets warmer by 2 degrees Celsius, we're screwed. Pardon the profanity. To prevent that, the United Nations signed the Paris Agreement, an international treaty designed to keep the average global temperature well below 2 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial levels. In other words, what the Earth was like before factories started spewing greenhouse gases into the air. Over the last 20 years, the 2-degree threshold has been referenced in policies and agreements made by the Council of the European Union, the GB, now the G7, and so forth. But we read this in the same article. Let this sink in. The same article, burying the lead, multiple paragraphs in. Quote, the last time the Earth was as warm as it is now was over 11,000 years ago. Huh? Men were living in caves. There wasn't a single factory on the face of the Earth. Maybe something else contributed to the warming of the globe 11,000 years ago. Now, the same article goes on to make this self-refuting claim. We're feeling the consequences of our actions. It's why the weather seems weirder than it was in the past. Well, that's a very scientific observation. The weather seems weirder. We must do something. Hurricane Harvey slammed Houston in 2017, and its unprecedented rainfall was 10 times more likely due to human-caused climate change. What's the basis for that statement? None. He made it up. In fact, the National Climate Assessment, says the article, recently concluded that extreme precipitation has increased in every region of the contiguous states since the 1950s. But then in the very next sentence, droughts and heat waves have also intensified, as is evident in California, which in recent years has seen less rain, drier soil, and the spread of wildfires. So at one and the same time, climate change caused by carbon dioxide and cow flatulence is blamed for too much and too little rain. Now, you might ask yourself, why exactly is this supposedly weird weather a threat to humanity in the first place? What's wrong with some weird weather? Indeed, why is a warming of 2 degrees centigrade, even if it were to occur, a threat to humanity? This is never explained, not in any convincing way. The closest they come is the allegation that CO2 rises will cause acidification of the oceans. But that data is summarized by Climate Depot. Quote, a modest long-term, 1800s to the present, declining trend in ocean pH values predominantly occurred prior to 1930, or before anthropogenic CO2 emissions began rising precipitously. Since 1930, seawater pH, meaning its base, not acidic, have risen slightly, meaning less acidic, meaning sharply rising CO2 has been coincident with less, not more, ocean acidification. What about the rising sea level? The theory is, well, the greenhouse gases trap the sunlight, the atmosphere is warmer, the water heats up, heated water has a greater volume, the oceans will rise, we'll all be drowned within a matter of moments. I give you the Argo array. This is 3,600 buoys in the global oceans. There's one buoy for every 3 degrees of longitude and latitude. It comes up with a survey of temperatures in the global oceans every 10 days like clockwork. Go to a site called skepticalscience.com, which tries to deal with the revelation that according to the Argo array, the oceans have been cooling since 2003. This is a pro-climate change website. It basically admits that that's what the Argo arrays have shown. But it says, well, there are other studies which say otherwise. And so the conclusion of this article is, and I quote, there is still uncertainty over reconstruction of ocean heat. It tries to ignore the Argo data. And then it says, by way of its ultimate conclusion, it cannot be concluded with confidence that the ocean is cooling. Wait a minute. They're telling us with confidence that the ocean is heating. This pro-climate change website says we can't conclude with confidence that it's cooling. Okay? So the whole thing is an illusion. Now, enter Pope Francis. You know I was going to get to him. Now, Pope Francis is the Pope. And the Pope is supposedly concerned, as John Paul II admitted he should be concerned, with the 4 last things: death, judgment, heaven, and hell, which John Paul II admitted in Crossing the Threshold of Hope have been lost sight of since the Second Vatican Council because of a new eschatological vision, a cosmological vision, as opposed to a vision of the individual's fate before God. But with Francis, we have the 4 first things: immigration, climate change, dialogue, and encounter. Now, he has gone far beyond the tentative statements by John Paul II. He has erected a veritable theology of climate change of his own invention, the new Greatest Commandment, to refer again to the title suggested by Kevin. So on June 18, 2015, as Kevin mentioned, he issued the encyclical Laudato Si. Now, let me say at the outset, there's a lot in the document that happens to be consistent with Catholic social teaching. No one denies perfectly legitimate criticisms of the excesses of capitalism. I've written a book on that myself, called The Church and the Libertarian. No one denies we should have solicitude for the poor. It's an obligation of our religion. But in its 185 pages, this document somehow fails to mention that poverty and oppression are the result of nation-states that have adopted socialist policies in the socio-economic sphere, which have caused the problems it identifies. But putting that aside, Laudato Si was intended to be much more than a presentation of some sound moral advice. It was a book-length manifesto written with the assistance of climate change fanatics such as Hans-Joachim Schellenhuber and Jeffrey Sachs, as well as Leonardo Boff, the infamous proponent of liberation theology and earth worship. First of all, as expected, the document, and this is what we all feared, commits the prestige of the Holy See to the junk science of climate change. This is what we have in the beginning of the document: recitations of fact by a Roman pontiff saying things he has absolutely no competence to say. Paragraph after paragraph of this stuff, not supported by even a single fake science reference. let alone a reference to real scientific studies. And I quote, "If present trends continue this century, we may well witness extraordinary climate change and an unprecedented destruction of ecosystems." Quote, "The melting of the polar ice caps can lead to a dangerous release of methane gas, while the decomposition of frozen organic material can further increase the emission of carbon dioxide." Did he make a trip to the Arctic to study these things? Where is he getting this from? There's not a single footnote in this part of the encyclical. Quote, "Climate change is a global problem with grave implications, environmental, social, economic, political, and for the distribution of goods, and represents one of the principal challenges facing humanity in our day." Quote, "The exploitation of the planet has already exceeded acceptable limits." How does he know what the acceptable limits are? Where is he getting this from? "The replacement of virgin forests with plantations of trees, usually monocultures, is rarely adequately analyzed." He doesn't like reforestation by monocultures. This is the Roman pontiff speaking about how he doesn't like monoculture reforestation. That's not good enough. You have to replace forests with exactly the same type of trees that were there before. This bothers him, so he puts it into the encyclical. "In some coastal areas," he goes on to say, "the disappearance of ecosystems sustained by mangrove swamps is a source of serious concern. Instead of the salvation of souls, you have a pope fretting about the mangrove swamps. Particularly threatened are marine organisms, which we tend to overlook, like some forms of plankton." When a Roman pontiff issues a document in which the word plankton appears, I think we have a problem. "Many of the world's coral reefs," he says, "are already barren or in a state of constant decline." No, they aren't. Go to Climate Change Depot. There's all kinds of studies showing that the increased carbon dioxide content actually it causes some of these reefs to flourish, and there's no real evidence that we're losing coral reefs. They're simply changing as they naturally do, growing in some places and diminishing in others. He goes on to say, "We know that technology based on the use of highly polluting fossil fuels, especially coal, but also oil and to a lesser degree gas — we can't even have natural gas now — needs to be progressively replaced without delay." Now, how are you going to replace the entire world energy system based on fossil fuels and natural gas? It simply is impossible. Even if this were a problem, there's no solution to it. But it isn't a problem. Even the few things I've given you by way of a sketch demonstrate that. And then he goes on to conclude, "Reducing greenhouse gases requires honesty, courage, and responsibility, above all on the part of those countries which are more powerful and pollute the most." End quote. Does anybody who says these things live as if he really believes them? Does this Pope show any signs that he's living as if his very presence on the face of the earth as a consumer of fossil fuels threatens the survival of the earth? Has he changed his behavior in any way that we can see? Has he abandoned his air-conditioned hotel room? Has he stopped his worldwide jet voyages, which create a greater carbon footprint in a few days than you and I will create in our entire lifetime? Has he done anything to indicate that he really takes this threat seriously? Have any of them done anything to indicate that they take the threat seriously as they jet all over the world in their carbon-consuming jet planes, and many times privately owned jets? It's all a massive bit of hypocrisy. Now, Laudato Si also provides recommendations for a green lifestyle, using public transport, carpooling, planting trees, turning off unnecessary lights, avoiding the use of plastic and paper, reducing water consumption, separating refuse. That's paragraph 211. So here the Vicar of Christ, I have to say it, is made to look rather ridiculous, providing the world with an environmental to-do list and fretting about, quote, "the increasing use and power of air conditioning, while humanity exhibits all the signs of moral degradation that have preceded," as Kevin noted, "divine chastisements throughout salvation history." He isn't concerned about that. He's concerned about the use of air conditioning, the mangrove swamps, and the plankton. And this while he lives, as I say, in an air-conditioned 5-star hotel, located in a perfectly manicured Roman enclave, fertilized with greenhouse gas-producing fertilizers, and goes in his fossil fuel charter jet to every corner of the globe, creating this massive carbon footprint. Here's what one rightly disgusted, and this is a non-traditionalist commentator, said. I won't embarrass her by quoting her by name. You've probably seen her stuff on the internet. Quote, "A strain of inadvertent comedy runs through Laudato Si. Il Papa assumes the posture of governance to the world. Mary Poppins on the throne of Peter. Who else could align the magisterium of the Catholic Church with the exhortation to turn off the air conditioner, shut the lights, and be sure to recycle? For this Christ died, to atone for petroleum products and for carbon emissions from private cars carrying only one or two people. Now, in another abuse, and that's what it is, of papal authority, Francis prescribes in this same encyclical globalist governmental solutions to the imaginary crisis, international agreements, global regulatory norms, systems of governance for the whole range of so-called global commons, such as the Amazon, which I'll get to in a moment, stronger and more efficiently organized international institutions whose functionaries are appointed fairly by agreement and empowered to impose sanctions, world government, in other words, with regulatory and enforcement power. And finally, to guarantee the protection of the environment and to regulate migration, a true world political authority. This is what the Vicar of Christ is recommending in an age of total planetary apostasy. He wants to put us under the thumb of atheistic bureaucrats. It is undeniable that there are environmental abuses, and no one can reasonably object to prudent environmental protection measures or sensible measures to reduce energy consumption. We shouldn't waste the world's resources. What can be questioned, however, is what Catholics have every right to question, whether the Roman Pontiff has any business weighing in on such technical questions with hotly disputed scientific opinions and vaguely proposed political solutions, including international treaties, regulatory frameworks, and world government. Furthermore, the environmental issues that Laudato Si catalogs have already been addressed locally in one way or another according to the principle of subsidiarity. This has been done at various levels. We didn't need any papal exhortations to address the problems. Some of these regulations have actually worked, as we see in the big cities, with the air pollution from cars having been dramatically reduced over the past 50 years. Industry can respond to these things. I happen to like the new light bulbs, if you really want to know. I think they give a nicer light than the incandescent ones. Things can be done without the Pope weighing in and calling for a global straitjacket imposed upon us to meet an imaginary threat. But Francis, seeing that there are, in fact, efforts to correct environmental problems which do exist at the local level, says, serving the aims of the globalist left, oh, that's not good enough. We must, he says, avoid a false or superficial ecology which bolsters complacency and a cheerful recklessness. According to Laudato Si, it is cheerfully reckless to think that, quote, apart from a few obvious signs of pollution and deterioration, things do not look that serious, and the planet could continue as it is for some time, end quote. No, we must not assume that if we correct an environmental problem here or there, clean up a river, reduce pollution in cities from motor vehicles, we must not think that's enough. No, the whole planet is in danger. And how can the Pope know this, you might ask? How can he know that beneath the obvious signs of pollution and deterioration, which are corrected in various places, or ought to be corrected, lies a threat to the very existence of the planet, despite the appearance of environmental soundness in most parts of the world? Of course, he can't do that. He has no capacity to make a judgment about that. No capacity whatsoever to assess the viability of planet Earth. And the encyclical's fundamental assumption that God created, and I quote, a fragile world, Laudato Si, paragraph 78, which is now on the brink of an environmental Armageddon, slights divine providence and exalts a worldly ideology to which the Pope has rashly lent the prestige of the Petrine office. So what we have here are the elements of nothing less than a kind of environmental religion. Beyond the embarrassments of the junk science and the naive political proposals, this is the fundamental development that we see in Laudato Si. It is the next phase, I would say the terminal phase, of the post-conciliar abandonment of the Church's divine commission to make disciples of all nations. Laudato Si calls, as Kevin mentioned, for a universal ecological conversion, which does not, of course, involve embracing any particular religion, much less adherence to the teaching of the Catholic Church on faith and morals, but rather, and I quote, a genuine and profound humanism to serve as the basis of a noble and generous society. Laudato Si, in short, is a papal embrace of the quasi-religion of environmentalism. It involves what the encyclical itself, quoting a French Protestant humanist, calls, quote, an effort to decipher the sacredness of the world. We worship the world. The world is a sacred thing. We must convert to a better relationship with the world, not to a better relationship with Christ, not to the salvific union of Christ in baptism and the life of the sacraments, but with the world by deciphering its sacredness. Now, there's an amazing speech given by the author Michael Crichton, science fiction author, back in 2003 about this environmental religion. Here's what he says. He's not even a believer. I think he's deceased now. Today, one of the most powerful religions in the Western world is environmentalism. Environmentalism seems to be the religion of choice for urban atheists. Why do I say it's a religion? Well, we must look at the beliefs. If you look carefully, you see that environmentalism is, in fact, a perfect 21st century remapping of traditional Judeo-Christian beliefs and myths. There's an initial Eden, a paradise, a state of grace and unity with nature. There's a fall from the state of grace into a state of pollution as a result of eating from the tree of knowledge. And as a result of our actions, there is a judgment day coming for us all. We are all energy sinners, doomed to die unless we seek salvation, which is now called sustainability. Sustainability is salvation in the church of the environment, just as organic food is its communion. Pesticide-free wafer that the right people with the right beliefs imbibe, end quote. Now, the elements that Crichton outlined are all to be found in Laudato Si, even if the document employs a certain amount of Christian verbiage in aid of its primary function as an environmentalist gospel, which is proclaimed not just to Christians, but, and I quote, every person living on this planet, end quote. It's a universal creed for humanity. Now, there is, first of all, in Laudato Si, just what Crichton notes, the concept of environmental sin. I quote from the document, from the encyclical. This sister, meaning the earth, now cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods which God has endowed her, with which God has endowed her. We have come to see ourselves as her lords and masters, entitled to plunder her at will. The violence present in our hearts, wounded by sin, is also reflected in the symptoms of sickness evident in, not souls, but the soil, the water, the air, and in all forms of life. That is why the earth herself, burdened and laid waste, is among the most abandoned and maltreated of our poor. She, quoting St. Paul in Romans, groans in travail, end quote, quoting Romans 8:22. Now, this is simply outrageous. First of all, let's talk about the quote from Romans, groans in travail. What is Paul talking about in Romans? He's not talking about sins against the earth. He's not talking about the earth crying out because we use air conditioning and drive cars that burn fossil fuel. This is an eschatological vision. It's a groaning of creation for its redemption by Christ. So, as he says in the full quote, from which Francis plucked 3 words, for I reckon that the sufferings of this time are not worthy to be compared with the glory to come that shall be revealed in us. For the expectation of the creature waiteth for the revelation of the sons of God. And then he goes on to say, because the creature also itself shall be delivered from the servitude of corruption into the liberty of the glory of the children of God. For we know that every creature groaneth and travaileth in pain, even till now. And not only it, but ourselves also, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting for the adoption of the sons of God, the redemption of our body, for we are saved by hope, not by recycling. St. Paul speaks then of an eschatological vision, but that's not the vision of Laudato Si. Laudato Si deliberately conceals the very point of St. Paul's luminous teaching, because that teaching is at odds with the encyclical's entire theme. St. Paul declares that only Christ's redemption And the grace it obtains can elevate fallen man in this life and restore a corrupted natural order at the end of time, not through environmental regulations. Until then, says St. Paul, the sufferings of this time, and I quote him, are not worthy to be compared with the glory to come, end quote. But Laudato Si is not concerned with the glory to come. Equally discrediting is the encyclical's abuse of the very words of our Lord himself. The encyclical quotes him as follows. After saying that he took up the biblical faith in God the Creator, they quote him as saying, "Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies, and not one of them is forgotten before God?" End quote. This, according to Laudato Si, shows that God has a paternal relationship with all his creatures. Well, sure he does, but that's not the point of the passage. Once again, words in isolation are plucked from the passage. What does our Lord really say? "I tell you, my friends, do not fear those who kill the body and after that have nothing more that they can do. But I will warn you whom to fear. Fear him who, after he is killed, has authority to cast into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him. Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies, and not even one of them is forgotten before God?" And the words immediately afterwards, which Laudato Si omits, without even an ellipsis. "Why, even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, you are of more value than many sparrows." The whole point of the passage is man is of infinite worth more than all the other creatures in creation combined, and that the death of even one immortal soul is infinitely worse than the death of any lower creature, even worse than the death of all the lower creatures on the earth taken together. But that truth would not serve the rhetorical purpose of denouncing man's crimes against the planet. So our Lord's reference to sparrows is plucked from its context as an affirmation of man's infinite worth, not the ecology's infinite worth. Now, lacking any scriptural support for this new religion, who does Laudato Si rely upon for spiritual authority? The Eastern Orthodox Patriarch Bartholomew, a schismatic. Here's what Bartholomew says, quoting him in the document. "Patriarch Bartholomew has spoken in particular of the need for each of us to repent of the ways we have harmed the planet. For, quote, inasmuch as we all generate small ecological damage." See, we're all sinning. When we turn on an air conditioner, we sin. When we don't recycle, we sin. If we waste some hot water, we sin. We're all guilty of this original sin. For human beings to destroy the biological diversity of God's creation, says the schismatic patriarch, for human beings to degrade the integrity of the earth by causing changes in its climate, by stripping the earth of its natural forests or destroying its wetlands, for human beings to contaminate the earth's waters, its land and its air and its life, these are sins. For, quote, to commit a crime against the natural world is a sin against ourselves and a sin against God. Well, there you have it. They have invented a new sin, a sin against the natural world. The world becomes an object capable of being sinned against. The world given to us for our use. Of course, we shouldn't abuse natural resources, but this is not a question of abusing natural resources. This is living life in the way that he doesn't approve of. We can't have a car, we can't use air conditioning, we have to recycle. And these are the new sins that they've invented out of nothing to serve this ecological religion. Now, a waste of natural resources is wrong. You shouldn't waste anything that God has given you. But it's not a crime against the natural world, which has no capacity to be the object of a moral offense. But in the judgment of a schismatic cleric who refuses submission to the Roman pontiff, except in this, of course, every man shares in sinning against the integrity of the earth, including each of our supposedly blameworthy contributions to changes in climate, as if change in climate were some kind of intrinsic evil that we are responsible for. How ridiculous is this? This notion that we're expected to swallow, that we cause climate change and that the resulting climate change is intrinsically evil and we're responsible for that evil. What utter nonsense. Now, following the schismatic prelate's lead, Francis later decreed that same year, the same date as in the Orthodox Church, the World Day of Prayer for the Care of Creation in order to implore God's, quote, pardon for sins committed against the world in which we live. Where is the World Day of Prayer for the hundreds of millions of aborted children? When do we make reparation for that? You know, I have to leave here immediately after this talk, go home, and on Monday go to Philadelphia because a pro-life advocate's on trial in federal court for standing outside an abortion mill at the driveway entrance offering literature to cars, some of whom stop and take his literature. They're claiming that when the cars stop voluntarily to take his literature, he violates the Freedom of Access to Clinics Entrances Act and should be fined $5,000 for each occurrence and subjected to an injunction keeping him 25 feet away from the driveway. You know, a woman came to him with a picture of the baby he had saved and said to him, if you hadn't been there that day, this baby wouldn't be alive. Where is the Pope's call for worldwide reparation for that tragedy repeated hundreds of millions of times? With Laudato Si, the environmental sin becomes the functional equivalent of original sin, as Kevin suggested. It taints every member of the human race. And just as Michael Crichton indicated, the result of environmental sin and the consequent fall of man is Environmental Judgment Day. And so Laudato Si declares, in appropriately apocalyptic tones, it is not enough to balance in the medium term the protection of nature with financial gain. Halfway measures simply delay the inevitable disaster. Doomsday predictions can no longer be met with irony or disdain. We may well be leaving to coming generations debris, desolation, and filth. The effects of the present imbalance can only be reduced by our decisive action here and now. We need to reflect on our accountability before those who will have to endure the dire consequences. Where is his plea to think here and now about your own fate if you should die today and face your judgment? One of the lawyers I work with in the pro-life movement, Thomas Portelli, was in his kitchen a few days ago, age 71, dropped dead. He is now facing his particular judgment. He's already gone through his particular judgment. And on we go in this encyclical with prattling about the environment and our duty toward the earth. Not a trace of indication in this encyclical of what really should concern the Roman pontiff, the fate of man, his eternal destiny. Now, his doomsday warnings are in marked contrast to Evangelii Gaudium. Evangelii Gaudium is very interesting because in Evangelii Gaudium, the other manifesto he produced, he quotes favorably John the 23rd's famous statement. You may remember this, where John the 23rd says, we feel we must disagree with those prophets of doom who are always forecasting disaster as though the end of the world were at hand. He quotes that, Francis does, approvingly in Evangelii Gaudium. Ha, 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 we're not facing doom, meaning spiritual doom. This is what the prophets of doom were talking about at the time of John the 23rd, that the world was sinking into an abyss. As Pope Pius XII said in 1950, the human race is involved today in a supreme crisis, which will issue in its salvation by Christ or in its dire destruction. So, on the one hand, Francis dismisses apocalyptic prophecies, even by his own predecessor. On the other hand, he fully embraces the apocalyptic prophecies of left-wing lunatics. But how do you resolve that contradiction? Well, it's easy. The preconciliar prophets of doom were speaking of doom in the sense of a civilizational apostasy, a rebellion against God. For them, the civilizational crisis was Christological, not ecological. But Francis doesn't see a Christological crisis in the world. He doesn't see a rebellion against Christ. He sees only an ecological crisis to which he devoted hundreds of paragraphs of nonsense. Now, in keeping with Pope John's fatuous optimism about the modern world, which was shown to be a total illusion, Francis dismisses these papal preoccupations, but he produces a 185-page manifesto on the environment. Finally, Laudato Si proposes the same way of salvation that Michael Crichton is talking about. To quote Francis, the urgent challenge to protect our common home includes a concern to bring the whole human family together to seek a sustainable and integral development. I urgently appeal for a new dialogue about how we are shaping the future of our planet. We need a conversation which includes everyone since the environmental challenge we are undergoing and its human roots concern and affect us all. He wants a worldwide discussion of how to bring about an ecological conversion, not a worldwide discussion on how to save souls from the eternal fires of hell, which is what Our Lady of Fatima came to talk to us about. So the way of environmental salvation for the whole human family must, says Laudato Si, involve, quote, a global ecological conversion, embracing all of mankind, and a reconciliation, quote unquote, according to which, quote, we must examine our lives and acknowledge the ways in which we have harmed God's creation through our actions and our failure to act, end quote. Not the ways we have harmed God or offended God, not the ways we have sinned against our neighbor. None of that appears in Laudato Si, but the ways in which we have harmed God's creation. We've sinned against the rocks and the trees and the dirt and the water and the animals. Not against God or a fellow man, at least not as far as this encyclical is concerned. This is not to suggest that Laudato Si is telling anyone that this conversion must involve an embrace of God, God's creation, because after all it is a divine creation. No, the manifesto is addressed to every person on the planet. And so Laudato Si actually makes excuses for bringing God into the picture. Here's what he says. Why insert in this document, addressed to persons of goodwill, a chapter referring to the convictions of faith? I am well aware that in the fields of politics and philosophy, there are those who firmly reject the idea of a creator and consider it irrelevant, to the point of relegating it to the realm of the irrational. Others view religions as constituting a subculture that is merely to be tolerated. Nevertheless, science and religion, which furnish different approaches to reality, can enter into an intense dialogue fruitful for both, end quote. Never in church history has a pope spoken of the convictions of faith as something whose insertion into a papal encyclical had to be justified to atheists. But then, no pope has ever written an encyclical that really has nothing to do with Catholicism as such. One other thing is worth noting. The idea behind this encyclical is essentially to create this universal religion, this eco-theology, devoid of any references to God, our relation to God, our offenses against God, the final judgment of God, death, judgment, heaven, and hell. All of that is to be hidden. Here's Exhibit A for that proposition. In the encyclical, the Canticle of St. Francis is quoted, but only the parts that talk about the animals. The brother sun, the sister moon, the brother wind, the sister water, and sister mother earth. Those are the things he says. It's actually a trope. He's paying tribute to God's creation as if to show that even these lowly things show the glory of God. But here's what he cut from the Canticle of St. Francis. No ellipses, nothing to indicate that the canticle has been censored. He took out these words: Most High, all-powerful, good Lord, yours are the praises, the glory, the honor, and all blessing. To you alone, Most High, do they belong, and no man is worthy to mention your name. Stricken. Praise be to you, my Lord, through those who give pardon for your love and bear infirmity and tribulation. Stricken. Blessed are those who endure in peace, for by you, Most High, they shall be crowned. Stricken. Praise be to you, my Lord, through our sister, bodily death, from whom no living man can escape. Out. Woe to those who die in mortal sin. Blessed are those whom death will find in your most holy will, for the second death shall do them no harm. Censored. Praise and bless my Lord, and give him thanks, and serve him with great humility. Cut. All of it removed. No one would know, unless you consulted the original Canticle of Francis, because Francis doesn't want any of that in this encyclical. In particular, suppressing the lines, praise be you, my Lord, through our sister bodily death, and woe to those who die in mortal sin, blessed are those in whom death will find your most holy will, conceals the canticle's true nature as a trope rather than a tribute to creatures as such. The canticle is actually a robustly Catholic eschatological tribute to the entire natural order in its fallen condition. But St. Francis's praise of our sister bodily death from his saintly and eternal perspective, hardly matches up with the encyclical's worldly and ecological perspective. As Father Shaw, the late great Father Shaw, writes, in this encyclical, sins and evils are transformed into social or ecological issues that require political and structural remedies. Now, one other topic has to be covered here. Despite its care for creation, its obsessing about the environment, its mourning of the loss of biodiversity and so forth, not one mention about the greatest threats to the ecology, abortion and contraception. Despite the ecological implications, there is not a single mention of the abortifacient effects of contraception or contraception at all, which is used massively worldwide. And by the way, there's powerful evidence that the discharge of female hormones into the water systems because of the use of the pill is affecting male fertility. They can't explain the incredibly rapid drop in male fertility rates over the past 30 years. What about abortion, the cold-blooded murder of human beings? Abortion, says Laudato Si, is, get this, inconsistent with concern for the protection of nature and compromises the very meaning of our struggle for the sake of the environment. That's paragraph 120. Because everything is connected, paragraph 117, and abortion reflects a, quote, lack of sensitivity towards the acceptance of new life and, quote, diminishes other forms of acceptance that are valuable to society. The first mention of abortion comes in paragraph 65, or rather 65 paragraphs after, the mention of the power of air conditioning. First, we worry about air conditioning. Then we make a passing reference to abortion 65 paragraphs later. But here's what he says about the extinction of plant and animal species. Each year sees the disappearance of thousands of plant and animal species, which we will never know, which our children will never see, because they have been lost forever. Oh, the plankton, too. The great majority become extinct for reasons related to human activity. Because of us, thousands of species will no longer give glory to God by their very existence, nor convey their message to us. We have no such right, end quote. Not a single sentiment along those lines is expressed as to the mass murder of human beings. Just what I quoted to you earlier. Nowhere does he say that the disappearance of hundreds of millions of human beings will mean children we never know, that their message will be lost forever. Nowhere does he say we have no right to kill children in the womb. He merely describes it as being insensitive to a certain aspect of creation. One must ask, in conclusion, in this discussion of Laudato Si, how it is possible to take seriously a call to respect God's creation in an encyclical that mourns the loss of plants and animals as an offense against God we have no right to commit, but then many pages later only weakly characterizes the destruction of, quote, human embryos because it compromises, quote, the very meaning of our struggle for the sake of the environment. I think it's enough to say that an encyclical in which a papal condemnation of excessive air conditioning appears 62 paragraphs before the first muted mention of legalized mass murder in the womb is a mockery of the papal magisterium. Consider one paragraph from the authentic social teaching of the Church, which bears on this same subject. Leo XIII in Rerum Novarum, quote, life on earth, however good and desirable in itself, is not the final purpose for which man is created. It is only the way and the means to that attainment of truth and that love of goodness which the full life of the soul consists. It is the soul which is made after the image and likeness of God. It is in the soul that the sovereignty resides, in virtue whereof man is commanded to rule the creatures below him and to use all the earth and the ocean for his profit and advantage. Quoting scripture now, fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fishes of the sea and the fowls of the air and all living creatures that move upon the earth, end quote. That is a true ecological sentiment expressed from the eternal perspective of man's eternal destiny. Now, since Laudato Si, and I'm coming to a conclusion, very few pages left, Francis has doubled down. On June 14th, he gave an address on the energy transition and care over a common home to a bunch of magnates of industry at the Vatican. He said, "Dear friends, time is running out. We cannot afford the luxury of waiting for others to come forward or of prioritizing short-term economic benefits. Today's ecological crisis, especially climate change, threatens the very future of the human family, and this is not an exaggeration. For too long, we have collectively ignored the fruits of scientific analysis." Actually, the climate change people are ignoring the fruits of scientific analysis. "And catastrophic predictions can no longer be viewed with contempt and irony." And his solution? A carbon pricing policy is essential if humanity wants to use the resources of creation wisely. The failure to manage carbon emissions has produced a huge debt that will now have to be repaid with interest from those who come after us. So we have the Vicar of Christ proposing a carbon tax. Now, Lord Christopher Monckton of Brenchley, a former advisor to Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, responded to this nonsense. And I'm going to quote some of the letter because it's important. It's a summary of what I've been talking about. "Your Holiness is reported as having told chief executives of oil companies and investment houses that inflicting heavy taxes on their corporate emissions of the satanic gas, carbon dioxide, was essential to prevent dangerous global warming. With respect, that was off message. What is more, Your Holiness proclaimed that we have collectively failed to listen to the fruits of scientific analysis, and doomsday predictions can no longer be met with irony or disdain. Well, says Lord Monckton, I have listened carefully, and I can inform Your Holiness that science is divided on the climate question. A large number of papers from reputable scientists and a larger amount of hard data suggest that global warming is and will continue to be a non-event. Consider the warming from 1850 to 2011. It was just 0.75 degrees. The totalitarians got the science wrong. They made a strikingly elementary error of physics. They forgot the sun was shining. So they misallocated the feedback response to the sun, erroneously counting it as part of the feedback response to greenhouse gases. What all that means, Your Holiness, is that the global warming that will happen between now and the exhaustion of available resources of coal, oil, and gas will be small, slow, harmless, and net beneficial. CO2 is plant food. They like it. Greenery flourishes in a higher CO2 environment. The same cannot be said, he goes on to say, of the insane policies currently being inflicted upon the world's blameless population by crazed Western extremists, now unwisely supported by Your Holiness. He talks about how the World Bank is refusing to lend development funds to build coal-fired power plants. This dismal institution has decided that from this year on it will not lend for oil or gas projects for the same reason. And what is the effect of this wicked policy, he says? According to the International Energy Agency, 1.3 billion people, 1/6 worldwide, has no access to electrical power. And what is access defined as? The ability to turn on a 60-watt bulb for 4 hours a day. They don't even have that. The World Health Organization estimates that 4.3 million people die every year from breathing in the pollution from wood fires. And then another 500,000 women die in childbirth because they have no electricity. In darkest sub-Saharan Africa, he says, the life expectancy is 65, compared with 80 years in the electrified West. And what about third world countries being told that they should use solar panels and wind farms? He says, and I quote, the electricity produced by these boondoggles is 5 times costlier than proper electricity from coal-fired power stations. They can't afford it. A few more scientific facts, he says. The sea level is not rising at the rate equivalent to 33 centimeters a century, only 11 centimeters a century. It's trivial. Floods, schmuds. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, neither the frequency nor the intensity of flooding has changed. Droughts, then? The previous 75 years, the percentage of global land under drought has declined. Food production? The output of all staple crops is increasing rapidly worldwide. Warmer weather is good for them because they breathe in carbon dioxide. CO2 is not a satanic gas, it is plant food. Hurricanes, tropical cyclones, tornadoes, all in decline. Deaths from extreme weather. Over the past 100 years, the number of weather-related deaths has plummeted worldwide. Cuddly polar bears, they're not cuddly, but there are now thought to be 35,000 of them, compared with 5,000 in the 1940s. He also notes that deaths from global warming will be vastly outstripped by the lives saved from cold weather, by heating. So, he concludes, given the egregious lack of evidence for harm caused by warmer weather, I invite Your Holiness to speak up for the poor who are poor and dying, because the policies Your Holiness imprudently advocates are not just scientifically unjustifiable, not just theologically off message, they are, not to put too fine a point on it, genocidal. The last point I want to cover, 5 minutes. The Synod on the Amazon. He's taking it to the next level. I'm not even going to get into the issue of the clear opening to the ordination of married men as priests and all the other things you've been reading about on the internet. I'll focus on the environmental aspect of this preposterous document. The Instrumentum Laboris for the Synod on the Amazon, which covers the entire Amazon region, and just to recall you for context, the Amazon region is the upper part of the South American continent. It includes Brazil, Venezuela, Colombia, Bolivia, the coastal places like French Guiana. It's twice the size of India. And through the middle of it runs the Amazon River. I've flown over it. It takes forever just to get across it on your way to some other country. It's a vast region. And it has mostly moist tropical forests covering it. He's using this region as a demonstration project for everything he would like to do in the church before his time is up. And I just want to quote from this Instrumentum Laboris a few notions along the lines of environmentalism. He denounces, for example, all of the following: hydroelectric projects, legal and illegal mining, waterways projects which threaten main tributaries of the Amazon River, hydrocarbon activities, meaning burning fossil fuels, livestock activities, deforestation, meaning using the forest, clearing forest, building, and reforestation. Monoculture, farming, agro-industry, and so forth. He's condemning, as contrary to his eco-religion, the activities that constitute human development and progress, which have characterized the entire Western world and are characterizing now the developing nations. He finds that a threat. He also denounces the massive felling of trees, the extermination of the tropical forest by intentional forest fires, clearing, in other words, to build things. The expansion of the agricultural frontier. We can't have that. We can't expand the agricultural frontier. How can you feed people? That's outrageous. And monocultures, in other words, reforestation. You take down trees, you put back trees. But according to him, there have to be many different varieties of trees. And so on and so forth. He says that the Amazon and the Congo are the lungs of our planet. And he raises the threat that the lungs of our planet are being destroyed. In fact, they aren't. Go read the data on the Amazon forest. It's not shrinking appreciably at all. The challenges presented is great, says he. And this is where it gets incredibly dicey. Now he's elevating the people who live in the Amazonian forests, the indigenous people, as models for the rest of us. To the aboriginal communities we owe their thousands of years of care and cultivation of the Amazon. In their ancestral wisdom, they have nurtured the conviction that all of creation is connected, and this deserves our respect and responsibility. The culture of the Amazon, meaning people in the jungles living in huts, which integrates human beings with nature, constitutes a benchmark for building a new paradigm of integral ecology. The church should assume in its mission to care for our common home. So he wants these people living in these jungles, in these primitive conditions, to be held up as a model for the rest of us, and he wants them to stay there. At the same time, he says we should hear the cry of the poor. Figure that one out. Many people, he says, have immigrated to the Amazon in search of housing, land, and work. They come in search of a better future for themselves and their families. Exactly. They abandon poor yet worthy lives. Just a moment. You said we should hear the cry of the poor. Now you're criticizing them for abandoning their poor but worthy lives. Which is it? They come in search of a better future, etc., etc. Many of them, in the hope that certain jobs will bring an end to their precarious situations, are drawn by the promising allure of gold mining, and on and on and on. The family in the Amazon, he says, has been the victim of colonialism. And here he exalts the noble savage, a la Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The imposition of a Western cultural model inculcated a certain contempt for the people and customs of the Amazon territory, even calling them savages or primitive. Who could think that someone practicing polygamy, living in a hut, who dies at the age of 50, is primitive? That's not primitive. That's a wonderful thing that we should all be emulating, because they're in connection with nature, and we can learn a lot from them and their way of life. Today, he says, the imposition of Western extractivist economic models once again affects families by invading and destroying their lands, their cultures, and their lives. He goes even further. Not only should we admire these people who are living in the crudest and most horrific of conditions as noble savages living in communion with nature, at the same time he complains about the poor. Not only should we admire them because of the way they live, we should admire their rituals and ceremonies. Paragraph 87. Indigenous rituals and ceremonies are essential for integral health because they integrate the different cycles of human life and nature. They create harmony and balance between human beings and the cosmos. They protect life from evils that can be caused by both human beings and other living beings. They help cure diseases that harm the environment, human life, and other living beings. He wants us to respect and encourage the rituals of shamans and witch doctors because they promote unity with the cosmos. This in a document approved by the Roman pontiff. And why did he approve it? Because as the document says, he became a disciple when he listened to the voice of the Amazon. Paragraph 92. And along those lines, it is proposed to value traditional medicine, the wisdom of the elders, and indigenous rituals, and at the same time to facilitate access to medicines that cure new diseases. So he wants us to go tribal. This is the ultimate prescription, and the Amazon is going to be the test project for this incorporation of the noble savage and his pagan rituals into Catholic life. And the rest of the document talks about liturgical enculturation, turning the liturgy into festivals of song and dance and pagan ritual. So, to conclude, I think only one word summarizes the situation we're now facing in this pontificate, and that word is madness. Modernist madness in its final stages. We are obviously witnessing a terminal state of affairs in the church from which only heaven itself can rescue us. And we know, the supporters of this apostolate know, as Father Gruner insisted for decade after decade, that heaven will rescue us. That is the promise of Our Lady of Fatima. But it seems now that that promise will be fulfilled in the midst of some very dramatic circumstances for the church and for the world. Our Lady of Fatima, pray for us. Thank you.